That's if I leave your camera on. Right?
Start
Now
blowing.
I'll see. I'll look at the window as I go through this, and so if you post anything through to me, I should notice it.
Okay.
So I am going to then switch over here to this, and I'm going to turn my camera off. If anybody has any problem with audio or anything like that, just let me know, or let Mark know. And you and April can turn yours off too if you want to.
I was just going to do that.
Or you can just sit there and let everybody watch you through the whole presentation. Alrighty, there we go. So tonight we are talking about waterfalls. I kind of broadened the topic a little bit to cover moving water in general, because the concepts are going to be the same for us, and some of the examples that I have are not just waterfalls, just to kind of illustrate some of the points. Okay, and I break my tradition here because normally I start with real technical stuff, but for waterfalls, the thing that I always get asked first is, well, what lens do you use? Well, that are the settings, and we definitely will get to the settings tonight as well. This is landscape photography like any other, so generally speaking, we're using wider lenses. For a full frame camera, whether it's mirrorless or SLR, that means we're using a 50 millimeter lens or wider, which means a shorter focal length or a smaller number. For an APS-C camera, then we're using about a 35 millimeter lens or wider, and for micro four thirds, we're using 25 millimeters or wider. How wide really depends on what you're seeing, how big the waterfall is going to be, or the water that you're shooting, and how far away it is. There are times that I have done waterfalls in this type of photography with a 70 to 200 when something is on the other side of a pond or at a greater distance, then you're going to need a longer focal length, but that's not typical. There are times that you might want something as wide as a 14, but again, that's kind of on the other extreme. So the lenses that we make that are really appropriate for this, we have a series of primes that are art lenses from a 14, 20, 24, 28, 35, 40. There's a 50 in there as well. And the zooms, we make a 12 to 24, 14 to 24, 24 35, 24 70, 24 105. There are also, sorry, hang on just a moment. Sorry for the delay. I think we should be better now. Those are for SLRs. For mirrorless cameras, the primes all exist. There is a new 14 to 24, 2.8. Mark, turn your mic off, please. Sorry, there's a 14 to 24, 2.8 specifically designed for mirrorless cameras. It's in a series that we call DN, meaning that it was designed from the ground up for mirrorless cameras. It's smaller and lighter than the SLR equivalent, for instance. There's also a 24 to 70 that is designed for mirrorless cameras as well. For the FP, which is our mirrorless camera, which a mount that we share with Panasonic and Leica, and Sony E-mounts as well. Okay, so that'll give you a basic idea. The question that I always get then is, well, what do you use when you go out? And the two lenses that I always have in my bag with me are the 14 to 24 and the 24 to 35 if I'm shooting with an SLR. If I'm shooting with a mirrorless, then I'm taking the 14 to 24 DN model or the 24 to 70 and the 24 to 70 DN. Okay. Other things that you're going to need other than your camera and your lenses is a good tripod. This is one time where you really want a good tripod. You don't want a little flimsy thing. You don't want something that costs $29.95 at Walmart. The better the tripod here, the better your results are going to be. We're talking about much longer exposures than normal, and any kind of motion, any vibration that's going to go through the tripod is going to translate into some loss of sharpness in the image. So having a really, really good stable tripod is very important for that. I like to have an L bracket. I have them on my cameras at all times. And an L bracket is just sort of like a tripod plate that goes around the side of the camera, goes across the bottom and up the side opposite the hand grip. And the benefit to it is I can switch between horizontal and vertical by just changing the orientation of the camera without tilting the whole tripod or the head of the tripod over to the side in order to try to support the camera that way. And that way I'm keeping the weight of the camera on top of the tripod, which makes everything more stable. It also means that when I rotate the camera, I'm not changing my perspective or my composition nearly as much as if I tilt the whole camera over to the side. So that's something that I like to have on my camera. If your tripod head is Arca Swiss compatible, then there are lots of companies out there that make L brackets for your camera. Then a cable release is almost vital, almost critical. You can get away with this type of work with a self-timer on the camera. But whatever it is, you want some way of triggering the camera without pushing the button on the camera. By pushing down on the shutter release, you're going to be shaking the camera. And you want to be able to trigger the shutter, release the shutter without that extra shake. So again, there are lots of companies that make cable releases, wired, wireless. Some cameras use the old-fashioned kind of cable, actual cable releases. And if not, almost any camera has a self-timer built into it, and even a couple seconds, whatever it is usually enough to stabilize the camera, let the shakes, the vibrations dampen before the shutter opens. Okay. An extra camera battery is always a good thing to have around. You should always have one in your bag, and you should always make sure it's charged. But for this in particular, we'll talk about some of the techniques that I use later, but one of them that I use a lot with landscape photography is live view. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and I'll get into them as we go through this. But live view on an SLR is going to drain the battery a lot faster than just looking at an image every once in a while on the LCD screen. And if you're talking about a mirrorless camera, using the LCD on the back rather than the small eye level finder, again, is going to drain the battery much quicker. So you know your camera, or you should know your camera, you know about how many images you're going to get out of it. So take an extra battery, even maybe two. Then we're talking water here, so if you're just standing on the side on a rock, you should be just fine. If you are, sorry, trying to read notes. If you're the adventurous type and you want that great composition, you may be standing in the water, you may be walking across pools of water to get to the vantage point that you're looking for. And a lot of times the water is really cold, especially if you're up in the mountains in the Appalachians or out west or something like that. So having hip boots or waders can be very useful. Having a towel to dry yourself off. The other thing that I forget a lot of times is lens cloths. We're talking about waterfalls. Water is going to be spraying up from where the water is cascading. So if there's any kind of wind, that mist could be coming right back at you and hitting your lens or your filter. So it might be nice to be able to dry off your lens in between shots. April, I do have an L bracket, but it's over on the other side of the room, so I will get it when we get to question time, and I can show people what an L bracket looks like in case anybody wants to see it. And then filters. I really, having filters will really increase the flexibility, increase the opportunities, increase the motion, the range of motion that you can show in an image with a waterfall. Most cameras are not capable of really blurring the motion to the point that most people want without a filter. So having filters are going to be a very, very important thing for this. There are basically three types. The first is a neutral density filter. The next is a polarizing filter. And then the third is a variable neutral density filter. And I will get into each one of those in just a moment. My recommendation for filters is buy filters for your biggest lens that you'd ever think you'd use that filter for. It will cost a little bit more, but it's a lot cheaper than going back and buying a bigger filter later. And most of the time, you can use a bigger filter on a smaller size filter ring on a lens using a step-up ring. And I have some of those here I can show you as well when we get to the end of this. There are other systems out there. There are square filters and rectangular filters and filter holders. If you already have that, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, it's kind of the next step in investment into bigger filters, more flexibility. But for this type of work, regular screw-in filters will do everything that I need them to do. And they're easier to carry around and smaller too. So as we go through these images, you can see the settings on here. So this was a second exposure, and you can see about how much water is blurring in there. F22 for two reasons. One is going to give us more depth of field, but it also helps to get longer exposures. We'll talk about that when we get into the settings here too. Okay, so with filters, the first is a circular polarizer. There are two types of polarizers. 99% of what are sold today are circular polarizers, and the reason for that is they are compatible with autofocus and auto exposure systems in cameras. The older linear polarizers can cause complications. So if you're looking for a polarizer, just make sure it's a circular polarizer. Sometimes they say C-pol or circ-pol, something like that, but you'll know that that's what it is. They generally absorb about 2 or 3 stops of light. They rotate. You can turn them and you can see the effect as you turn the filter, and it will change somewhere in that range, stop and a half or 2 stops up to 3, maybe 4 stops, depending on the conditions in the actual filter and that kind of thing. So for one, it helps us with waterfalls because it just takes away light and increases our exposure. 2, then it will help to darken the sky. It deepens the blue of the sky. It helps to absorb some of the light that's causing glare in the sky. It also helps minimize reflections or glare off of the surface of the water. So if you have a pool of water at the bottom of a waterfall, then a circular polarizer can help you see through that water. Okay. The next then is a neutral density filter, and a good neutral density filter does exactly that. It just adds density that is neutral. The idea is that it doesn't color your image at all. They're gray or almost black, some of them, charcoal really dark, but the idea is that they're not going to change the image, they just decrease the exposure. And by decreasing the exposure, then we can increase our shutter speeds and have longer shutter speeds, more motion blur in the water, whether it's waves in an ocean or a waterfall or whatever it is. There are definitely bad neutral density filters that will color an image, and to some extent you can correct for it in the camera, but you'll hear me over and over again tell you to make sure that you buy good filters. Way too often I see people buy good lenses and put cheap filters on the front, and it's a shame. Then the third category here is a variable neutral density filter. And a variable ND is actually 2 polarizers stacked together. So you're getting even more exposure, more increase, but because you can rotate one in relation to the other, it's a variable amount of light that it absorbs. So they usually come in ranges of about 1 to 5 stops, or maybe 2 to 10 stops or something like that. They generally have the same effect as a circular polarizer in that you can watch the sky darken and help to eliminate glare off of water and those kind of things. So they can be very, very useful for this. but they also give us more exposure decrease. They absorb more light than a traditional or typical circular polarizer does. So they're a very, very useful filter for this type of work. And, well, I'll get to that in a second. One thing to consider, I've tried a number of them. The ones that go to 10 stops, usually at about 7 or 8 stops, start to show this kind of starburst pattern in the middle of the image. You get this giant like cross shape, and it turns as you turn the filter, but it makes the filter totally useless over that level. It does depend on the direction of the light and the intensity of the sun and other factors. But I used to use a 10-stop variable ND, and I found that I couldn't use it over about 6 stops anyway, reliably. So I ended up switching to a different one. I'll get to that part in a second too. As far as the filters, what's going to happen, you can actually hold the filter up to your eye and look through it at the scene, and you will see the color of the sky darken, the blue in the sky get deeper, and you can see reflections change on the surface of the water. So while you're there, you can twist the circular polarizer in front of your face, in front of your eye, and then try to get it on the lens at exactly that orientation, so you know that your camera is going to see what you just saw looking through the filter. And if you aren't familiar with this, this is one of the drawbacks of doing classes online, is that I can't put my filter in your hands and let you see exactly what it looks like. But the next time you're with somebody who has one, and the next time you're in a camera store, take a look at a polarizer. Go outside and look at things, the sky or reflections off of glass or whatever, and then you can see exactly what a circular polarizer can do. As far as what I carry with me, I have a circular polarizer, I have a 5-stop variable ND filter, and I have a 10-stop regular neutral density filter. And what I have found is about 90% of what I do for moving water is with the 5-stop variable ND. That almost always gives me enough exposure increase to get the motion in the water the way I want it to be. If not, I can pull that off and add the 10-stop regular ND and then make some changes to the exposure in the camera to get it exactly where I want it to be. Or if I want to do something really long, like a 4-minute exposure or something longer than that, I can combine the ND, the 10-stop ND, and the 5-stop variable ND together, and I have 15 stops of exposure change between my regular exposure without filters and both of them. The one thing you don't want to do is combine a circular polarizer and a variable ND. The reason for that is the variable ND is already 2 polarizers. You don't want to put the third one in front, or you can see all sorts of different things in the image, like that cross pattern I was talking about. It can really cause some complications with your images. And I have the filters here too. I don't know what they really are going to look like to the camera, but I'm happy to show you the system that I have here. That's mostly to show you just the freezing of the water, but also the reflections off the water. Okay. So I says proper technique. I'll say my techniques. Everybody has their own method of doing things, but when I'm shooting landscapes, when I'm shooting water especially, I'm always trying to keep my ISO as low as possible. Generally, I try to go with what's called the base ISO, which is the lowest native setting, or you might have heard the term that way, native ISO. And we'll talk about that here in just a second, exactly why that is and why you really want to keep your camera at that point for this type of work especially. So I'm going to start with that. The camera that I shoot with, the native ISO is 64. So I've already got a third of a stop over some cameras that go to 100. I have a stop and a third over some cameras that have a native ISO of 200. And then there are actually cameras out there that have a native ISO of 400, which means I'm 2 1/3 stops. Better for this type of work than a camera with a higher native ISO is. Okay, so I'm going to start there. Then I want to think about aperture for two reasons. The first is for depth of field. So I definitely want to keep my aperture high enough to keep everything in focus that I want to be in focus. And there are times that you can't do that, and then you get into focus stacking, and that's another class for another day. But let's just assume that we can get the whole scene in at f16 or f22. The other thing that does for me, though, as that number goes higher, the iris in the lens, the aperture blades are closing down, and it's letting less light through the lens, which means that my exposure is increasing, or my shutter speed is getting longer in order to get proper exposure. And that's ideal for what we're doing here. Normally that can be a complication, but for this, because we have a tripod, we're not worried about shutter speeds being too long to handhold an image. And we usually want the blur of the water to come through. There are times you don't. One question that I almost always get when I tell people that they should shoot at f22 is, aren't you worried about diffraction? And diffraction is just the phenomenon of the particles of light raking over the sharp blades in an aperture and slightly bending out of plane, if you will. It's just a slight loss of sharpness in an image when you have the aperture blades stopped way down. And my answer is always the same, that I would rather have an image with the right depth of field and the right motion and trade off a tiny bit of sharpness rather than have an image that doesn't have enough depth of field or doesn't have motion frozen or blurred the way I want it. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have to worry about it. And with most modern lenses, it's not a huge issue, but it's there. If you want to do some research on it or you want to ask me about it later, we can get into a little bit more about it. And so then the next setting on the camera, the only one left really, is shutter speed. So then I have to think, do I want to freeze the motion of the water? Do I want to blur the motion of the water? And if I'm freezing water, I'm probably going to start at least a 60th or 125th, but probably even 250 or 500. If it's a fast moving, if the water's moving fast, it could even be faster than that. If I wanted to blur the motion of the water, I'm going to start at about 1/4 of a second. That's just where I begin. To me, if it's much shorter than that, it kind of looks like an accident. So I usually start at about a 1/4 second, 1/2 second, 1 second, and then I'm not afraid to go all the way up to 30 seconds or whatever my camera is set to, if that's the proper exposure. But that's my preference, and this really is definitely a preference thing. How much blur do you want the water? How creamy do you want that water to look? After that, then, in order to get to the right exposure, I'm going to use filters to absorb some of the light. Because if I just set my ISO to 64, my aperture to 22, and my shutter speed to 4 seconds, it's going to be way too bright almost any time of day. So that's where the filters come into play. So I put a neutral density filter or a variable ND in front of the lens, and it's going to absorb that light and bring the exposure back down to normal, if you will. Then my suggestion or recommendation for all of this is do everything, though, without the filter first. Get the image composition, check your focus, and if you haven't heard the guideline, the rule of thumb, you generally focus about 1/3 of the way into the scene. So I'm looking at the closest rock that's in my picture and the back of the waterfall or the trees above it or whatever, and I'm going to focus about 1/3 of the way from that rock to those trees, and then move up my aperture to get everything in focus. So I'm checking that. I'm checking my basic exposure without turning my shutter speed up to 4 seconds or 8 seconds or whatever. I'm just going to start with it at 15th or 30th or whatever the camera thinks is right. Then I'll look at the histogram on the camera. I'll look at the clipping to make sure that the white clouds or whatever light color, the white on the water, isn't blown out. And then once I have the right exposure, I can just increase from there. So if I'm using a 5-stop ND filter and my exposure was 1/8 of a second, well, I go from 1/8 to 1/4 to 1/2 to 1 second to 2 seconds. So I don't really even have to adjust anything. I mean, I don't have to look through the camera and try to make an adjustment or guess or anything like that. I can just put the filter on the front of the lens, change the shutter speed up to 2 seconds, and then take the picture from there. As long as nothing else has changed, the change in the shutter speed and putting the filter on will balance each other out. I guess I should start this proper technique with manual exposure, because you do not want the camera making any decisions for you here. The camera will get this wrong every time. I can almost guarantee it. When I'm looking at white in the water, it's going to expose wrong. It's never going to suggest that you shoot at 4 seconds or 8 seconds or 30 seconds or something like that. The only other thing that I didn't mention here too is white balance, and white balance can just be set to daylight. I generally keep my camera on that when I'm shooting landscapes, because if I'm shooting in the morning or the evening, which is most of the time, then the white balance is automatically going to turn the colors a little bit warmer than they would normally be if I just shot in auto white balance. So I just leave the camera in daylight most of the time anyway. And as long as you're close, you can tweak it a little bit in Lightroom, but you don't want to be totally off and not have any, or whatever. You don't want to be totally off and not be able to correct it in Lightroom, sorry. Okay. So look at these two. You can see what 8 seconds of relatively rapid moving water does. That's almost a second. So I told you I'd explain base ISO, and base ISO in your camera is just where your camera, the converter essentially in the camera that figures out how many photons of light hit each little sensor, each little pixel in the sensor, and converts that to an electronic signal. But it has to be based at a certain sensitivity. And wherever that is, whatever number the manufacturer built that system around is the native ISO or the base ISO. And the advantage to it, excuse me, the advantage to that is it will give you the most dynamic range, which is value of light from highlight to shadow. So you're going to see the most shadow detail, the most highlight detail, without the shadows turning black, the highlights just blowing out. You'll see more color. You'll get less noise. You'll have the cleanest files. So the other advantage to a base ISO is, again, because we're turning the ISO down, it makes the camera less sensitive, which means we can get longer exposures, which are generally typical, or generally what we're looking for waterfalls. But it's also going to give us the best file, the best image that we can capture from the camera. Okay. There are cameras that have low settings, like a lot of cameras have high settings above their top aperture or top ISOs. There's some cameras that have low 1 and low 2, and it's just an artificial change in the sensitivity of the sensor. It's not perfect. They're good. Some of them are better than others. If you have those functions on your camera, try them out. My suggestion to you too is shoot exactly the same thing at low 1 and low 2 and the native ISO on your camera, and then go back and look at them on the screen and see which ones you're happy with. If you can't see a difference, then by all means use low 1 or low 2 when you're out shooting, because it's just going to give you longer shutter speeds. It's going to make it easier to get to those longer shutter speeds. Okay. Some suggestions, tips, things to watch out for. The first one is when you're dealing with shutter speeds at this length, when you're dealing with things that are shorter than a 15th or a 30th of a second, or longer rather, lower numbers. So when we're dealing with half seconds, 2 seconds, 30-second exposures, everything seems to shake the camera. And this is why I said it's really important that you have a very solid tripod. Some tripods have hooks on the bottom of them. You can even hang a weight or your camera bag or something from the bottom of the tripod and help to dampen the vibrations even more. Even wind can shake a tripod, and again, the flimsier tripods are going to be more susceptible to that. Even water, if you're out there shooting, you put your tripod legs in water and it's moving very quickly, it can even shake the legs of the tripod. So always be aware of those types of things. It's really terrible to be out shooting for hours and shooting for 30 seconds at a time to come back and look at your images and realize that none of them are really sharp because the wind was blowing too fast or the water was moving around the tripod or whatever. Your hands on the camera, you don't want to touch the lens. You don't want to push the shutter release button, any of those kind of things. And bridges, if you're the only one out shooting, just don't move and you're fine. But when there's a whole group of people, it gets really, really difficult shooting from a bridge. Even a solid, pedestrian bridge that feels really solid, you'll start to notice that there can be some kind of vibration. Even a big traffic bridge, you can set your tripod up and a big truck goes by and it can shake everything. You can ask me, I have plenty of images for bad examples of this. The question coming in, do I sandbag the tripod for fast moving water to reduce vibration? I do try to hang some kind of weight from it, yes, or wrap a sandbag around the top of the tripod. That definitely helps. The more weight is on the tripod pushing down or pulling down, the more stable your tripod is going to be. So I definitely like tripods with a center hook. I'm not a fan of tripods with center columns, and this type of work is why, because those three legs of the tripod are a lot better at stabilizing and dampening vibrations than one column in the middle holding up the camera. So, but yes, sandbags are great ideas. There are a lot of companies that make bags that are empty that you can fill with gravel when you're at a location. You could throw water bottles in it, and then they'll either wrap around the top of the tripod or hook on the center column. And those are great things to have too. And that way you don't have to carry sand with you. You can just dump it back out, dump the rocks out before you leave. And most of them are really rugged canvas. You can just rinse them out in the river and take the empty bag home with you. Like I said, I'm going to tell you more than once, make sure your filters are at least as good as your lens. There is no reason to spend $1,000 or $2,000 on a great lens only to put a $20 filter on the front of it. You're throwing away all that money that you put in as an investment to your camera equipment. So don't cut corners after you buy the lens. Make sure that you're dealing with good filters. April carries some great filters. I've worked for some of the companies that she sells, and I can recommend some too, but we can talk about that kind of thing as you go down here, or as we go on. As far as composition, especially with wide-angle lenses, I find it difficult sometimes to have really dynamic, interesting images. And almost always what makes the image really interesting is something in the foreground, a rock, a reflection, swirls of leaves on the water. Again, some kind of light reflecting off the surface of the water, a leaf on a rock, anything like that, but just something to give the foreground interest. It's very, very easy to shoot with an ultra wide lens like a 14 or a 20 millimeter lens and have nothing in your foreground, and it just loses its impact. Everything becomes so small and similar size in the frame. So you want to think about that when you're out looking. Find the vantage points that have the rock in the foreground, or one little cascade of water at the bottom, something to just lead your eye through an image. My recommendation for anybody, any type of work, is absorb as much good photography as you can. So if you want to shoot waterfalls, look at waterfall photography. Look at some of the people out there whose work you admire. Google some, ask your friends, your camera clubs, whatever it might be. We can direct you to sources of good photography. But then the question comes, yes, I like this, I don't like this, but then you have to figure out why. And that's always the question, and that's hard for a lot of people to do. But the more you can figure out why you like one image and don't like another image, the faster, the better you're able to put those into your own work, and the faster your work is going to improve, and the happier you're going to be with the photography and the process. Okay. Something I always tell people too: 99.9% of us are shooting digital, and we don't have to pay for film. We don't have to pay for processing. Once you bought the camera, the lens, the filters, the tripod, and the memory card, battery, whatever else. But once you bought all that stuff, you can take as many pictures as you want and throw away as many as you want. And that's great because you can learn faster by making more mistakes faster and not having to literally pay for each one every time you developed and processed images. So while you're out shooting, try different shutter speeds. Um, I always get people like, well, I like a quarter of a second. I like 4 seconds. I like to shoot 30 seconds. I have friends who put stack 10-stop ND filters and will go out and shoot the surf on a beach in the middle of the day for 30 minutes or longer. And it's some incredible work, some incredible looks. But it's all a question of what your preference, again, what you think looks right or what you want it to look like. And the best way you're going to be able to figure that out is looking at images, seeing how somebody else shot it, and then going out and trying it on your own. So try different shutter speeds, try different filters, try an ND and try a variable ND, or try an ND and a polarizer, and see how the image looks different between those two. And then you can dial in different strengths of the filter, and that's going to change things as well. And then while you're out there, try different compositions. Try something low, try something higher up, try something bigger in the foreground or less in the foreground. Move around, that kind of thing. I think I mentioned this at the beginning. I use live view a lot. I do a lot of macro photography too, and I almost exclusively use live view for that. And the reason for it is, well, one of the reasons is I don't have to lie down on the ground to look behind the camera. If my camera is down on a rock or a foot off the water or whatever, it makes it a lot more convenient for me to look at the screen on the back rather than getting my eye to the back of the viewfinder on an SLR. The other, though, is there are tools that I can use on the screen for photography that I can't see through the viewfinder of an SLR. And I know this is one of the big benefits of the mirrorless cameras is I can see a lot more information through the eye level finders. But one of those is some confirmation of focus. Most mirrorless cameras have focus peaking, which just means it shows you, it's usually red, sometimes they change colors, but it shows you a kind of speckled image around the outline of something when it's in focus. So you know that is where the plane of focus is in your image. Most SLRs, when you're in live view, you have focus magnification. So on mine, I have it turned on so the center button enlarges the image to 100% to pixel level. So I can fine tune the focus much more accurately than I ever could looking through the viewfinder of the camera. Again, whether it's mirrorless or SLR, doesn't matter. I can also use exposure clipping, highlight warnings, those kind of things. I can see the histogram. I can use all of those tools on the screen, especially when I'm in live view. I can flip through all of those things before I take the image rather than looking at them all in review after I take an image. So like I said, I use live view a lot for that. And it's nice to have a flip screen, but not critical. But again, the point, sorry, okay. The point of all that is that live view is going to decrease your battery life. Sorry, we're echoing. Bear with me. think we're good. Does everybody hear me? I'll just assume that's a yes. We have a question coming in that says, do you find better results sticking with standard amounts of natural light, like around golden hour times, or do you prefer it darker or lighter? I generally don't shoot darker than golden hour, morning and evening. And then middle of the day is just sort of a question of how much filtration I have with me and what the subject is going to look like. There's some places that in the middle of the day there's just too much harsh light and too dark of shadows, and there's just too much range of value to try to capture, and it just looks harsh, and it's never going to be pleasing the way I want it to look. The other side of that, though, is there's sometimes that even in the morning, golden hour, or in the afternoon, in the evening, that at golden hour there may not be enough light left showing on the waterfall that I want to photograph. So it kind of varies, but I generally am not shooting in really dark situations where I have to go with really, really long exposures. There are some times that I've played around with, surf on the beach at night, or and there's a waterfall that I want to shoot at night, but just haven't made it to get that one yet. Please explain live view again with emphasis on the features you use, such as magnification, please. Absolutely. So I'm mostly talking about live view. Well, I'm talking about live view on an SLR because on a mirrorless, it's all live view, right? Everything that you see on a mirrorless camera, whether it's through the viewfinder or on the LCD screen, is the same. But most of these things will still apply to a mirrorless camera or a DSLR. So the first reason that I use live view is for some sort of focus confirmation. In a mirrorless camera, it's generally focus peaking, P-E-A-K-I-N-G, and it just shows you a colored fringe around the portion of the image that is in focus, the sharpest part of the focus, the plane of focus. It's using contrast to where light pixels and dark pixels meet, and it knows that it's in focus. It's the same way that the camera itself actually autofocuses. But I don't want autofocus on my camera for this kind of thing, because inevitably when I push the shutter release down, it's going to refocus on someplace that I didn't want it to. So I'm in manual focus. On a DSLR, though, you can generally turn on a feature. It's going to be in your menu somewhere. It's usually in the custom functions or the custom controls, where you can zoom in to 100% on live view. So I shoot Nikon cameras, and I have the center button under the little joypad, the thumb pad, programmed in live view that when I push that button, the image itself will magnify to 100% where the focus point was, the actual point where I was selecting focus in the first place. It will zoom into 100%, and then I can focus, very fine-tune the focus with the lens until that image is as sharp as it could possibly be. But I'm looking at it with so much more resolution, so much closer than I would be able to looking through the viewfinder of a camera. That feature will be on any mirrorless camera as well. I can still zoom into 100%, or I can zoom into twice normal or 8 times or whatever it would normally be. You can usually set that through the menu of the camera, but I can make a mirrorless camera zoom in as well. RFP, I know this better than the Sony's, because that's the mirrorless camera that I use the most. And the camera is actually set, I think by default, that when you turn in manual focus mode, when you turn the focus ring, it automatically zooms in the image to the focus point, so you can focus much more accurately. Okay. Then other things on live view that I'm using, I use what's called exposure highlight warning. Sometimes it's called clipping warning. Some people call it the blinkies, because normally when you turn it on, whatever is overexposed, whatever is beyond the limit of the sensor to capture in the highlight range will flash. You can usually change the color too, but it's usually just flashes white. So you know that that part of the image is overexposed. A lot of landscape photography, we're shooting clouds. We don't want the clouds overexposed. With water photography, any of the bright part of where the water is bubbly and creamy and all that is white, but we want there to be a little bit of detail. So we don't want very many pixels to be blown out. So I'm using highlight warning a lot as well. There is then the histogram, which is a map of exposure values, black on the left, white on the right. And it's just a map of how many, or a graph of how many pixels there are in your image that are light or dark. But you don't want that graph to be pushed up against one side or the other. If it's all the way up against one edge, you're losing highlight detail if it's pushed over to the right, shadow detail if it's pushed over to the left. I think that's about all the things that I was talking about with live view. So hopefully that answered your question. If not, ask another one. What key indicator am I looking for in the water to achieve the swirls in the final image, or is that achieved in a single shot or multiple shots merged? I am not one to do multiple shots for anything. If I can't see it on the back of the camera when I took the picture, then I'm probably just going to keep trying until I do. One reason is I would much rather be out taking pictures than sitting behind my computer editing pictures. So I like to capture the swirls in the shot. It is a little bit trial and error. What I'm looking for is, it's called an eddy. It's just the portion of water that's off the fast moving channel, and it generally circles around. And a lot of times you'll find it behind a rock. So the water comes past the rock, and the water will actually curl around much slower, and it'll curl around in a circle right behind that rock off of the fast moving water. You can cheat, and you can just grab a couple leaves and throw it in. But the slower it's moving, then the shorter the shutter speed that I'm going to be able to shoot with and capture that kind of motion. And you can kind of watch. You can watch one leaf. Just throw a leaf down in that pool and watch it spin around. And you can say, well, it moved halfway around in 4 seconds. So if I throw 6 or 8 leaves in there and shoot for 4 seconds, then I'll have a nice little swirl of leaves moving around. There are times that water bubbles will come in off that channel and swirl around as well. So you can watch for those kind of things. And then, like I said, trial and error. Take a picture and look at it where you are. If there's nothing showing up, it's probably too long. Then you can back off on your shutter speed. If the swirls aren't long enough, then increase your shutter speeds. Whatever it is, turn the filtration up. Turn the aperture up in order to get the shutter speed a little bit longer, and then you should be able to get the swirls that you're looking for. I suppose that you could do multiple images and recombine them. The problem is going to be that one trail will end and another one begin in images, so it's going to be harder to put together than focus stacking or some other types of photo merge. So. All right, keep asking questions. I just have a couple more images to show, and then I'll come back on camera and show you a couple of the things here that I have with me, and then answer some more questions for you. So that's ocean. That's an inlet in St. Augustine if you've been there. But to give you an idea what 30 seconds of exposure can do, the water is, even though it would have been choppy while we were there shooting, the water just all evens out and gets like smooth and silky looking with a 30-second exposure. And again, there's some texture in the water, but at 5 seconds you get a lot of blur to it. And again, 30 seconds, and that's, to me, that's kind of the typical amount of blur or white, silky, creamy looking waterfalls that I'm looking for. Some people say that's too long, but again, that's all down to your personal preference. Okay. So let's see. I'll show you a few of the filter things here real quick. These are step-up rings. I don't know, again, what you're going to be able to see from the camera. They're just simple little brass rings that are a smaller filter size on the inside and a bigger filter size on the outside. So most of my filters are 82 millimeter filters because that's the biggest lens filter size that I need to put on a camera. Then I can put that an 82 millimeter filter on the front of this and screw it into a lens that has a 77 millimeter thread. And then this will actually take that from 77 down to 67. And now I need to buy a 77 to 72 because we came out with a new lens that has a 72 millimeter thread on it. But that way I only have to have one set of filters, and I can use that and use the filters with multiple lenses. And these are just simple filter pouches. These are from Schneider, but just about anybody makes those, just to give a little bit of added protection to the filters in the bag. This is the 10-stop ND. It's got to be on there. I really need to find that on there, but you can see, like, you can't see anything through that really. It's absorbing 10 stops of light, and 10 stops is a lot of light. So it looks basically black. It looks opaque. I can barely see the lights over there through that, so you can see how dark that really is. And that's going to take a 30th of a second. I always have to do the math. So 15, 8, 4, 2, 1, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds. Well, that was easy. So that will take my exposure to 30 seconds, even in broad daylight, with a 10-stop ND. Think Tank makes several nice filter holders. Yeah, there actually are. These are all individual pouches, and there are companies that make, like Think Tank makes a pouch that holds multiple filters, and it would be a great idea. I happen to work for this company, and they gave me the pouches when I bought the filters. So that's why I use them. And this is the circular polarizer. I don't know. Actually, you can, because I can see me on camera. So you can see it get darker, and you can see it get lighter. Okay, so this will absorb anywhere from 1 to 5 stops, basically. And there are markings on the side to kind of give you an idea where those stops are taking place, and to be able to set it again the same way. I'm falling behind on questions, and I apologize. What type of filters am I using in these pictures? These are all B+W filters. I worked for the company, but I worked for the company partly because I'm a big believer in their filters. They are made out of a glass from a German company called Schott. They are some of the best, most clear, most pure, most perfect optical glass. And the technology in their polarization, their neutral densities are perfectly neutral. I don't think you can buy a better filter. There are other companies out there that make really good filters, but I don't think you can buy anything better than B+Ws. So even this is a B+W variable ND. It's MRC, which is their multi-coated. And April would probably have to quote this now, but an 82 millimeter variable ND is going to run somewhere around $250 or $300. It is not a cheap filter. Even cheap variable NDs are going to be $100. If it's less than that, you really don't want it. Circular polarizers are half or a third of that price, of the $300 price. And neutral density filters are even less than that, generally speaking. So, and filters always depends on the size of the filter too. The bigger they get, the more expensive they are. I should say, since I work for Sigma, we make some great filters. We really do. They're made out of, again, some of the best glass that you can buy. They're made out of the same type of glass that goes in our lenses, so they are a perfect match to our lens, not to say that somebody else's aren't. The one thing I would say, though, is we don't make all the range of neutral density filters that somebody like B+W makes. we don't make variable ND filters. We do make a polarizer that's a great polarizer. And I think we make a basic ND filter. But, okay. What else was I going to show? An L bracket. I'll go grab that if anybody wants, but oh, somebody does want. Okay, so while I'm gone, this is the new 85 1.4 for Sony and FP for L mount. For our camera, it's like 2 inches shorter than the previous SLR model or the previous Sony model, and it's a pound lighter. So I'm just going to leave that on the table while I go grab an L bracket. That was enough of a sales pitch on the new lens, right? So this is the camera that I shoot with the most, and this is the L bracket. If you can see that, it's a little bit better. So it is an Arca Swiss plate here, an Arca Swiss plate here. There's an opening in the middle so I can open the little doors and plug things in if I need to. They make them for cameras with or without grips attached. I'm trying to get like more light on the front of the camera so you can see all this stuff a little bit better. See the L bracket. All right. So you basically buy it for body alone or body with grip built in. There are cameras like the D5 or something from Nikon that is one solid body, so the L bracket's always that shape. Hold it in front of the gray background. Yeah, it's just dark. I think the easiest thing for me to do is just take it off the camera. So bear with me. It's funny, it's probably never come off this thing before. It's even stuck. Oh, there it is. So it's just that. Oh, and this piece. Sorry, they made it more complicated than they need to be for me. There you go. There's the whole L bracket. So most of them, you can get them like form fitted, custom fitted to an individual camera, or you can buy a more, I don't want to say generic, but more flexible thing that you can put on different cameras that are just flat. It just depends on how often you switch cameras, how much money you want to invest in something like this. And again, there's a number of different companies that make L brackets like that. Does that answer the questions for that? This one is specifically made for the camera body. This is made by a company called Really Right Stuff that makes great products at a premium price. There are, like I said, there are a number of other companies. Three-Legged Thing makes probably the best universal one that I know of, and they make some specific ones for specific cameras as well. Kirk used to make them. Pro Media Gear, who actually makes the tripod behind me, they make a number of L brackets as well. So there's a lot of different options out there. Oh wow, my favorite waterfall in Georgia. Uh-oh, not do that again. I'll always like Toccoa, but I haven't been there in a long, long time. Emekol is fun to hike, but it's not the prettiest waterfall. So, ironically, even though I live in Georgia, in Greater Atlanta, most of the waterfalls that I photograph are either North Carolina or Tennessee. Just one, there are more up there, but there are lots of waterfalls in North Georgia. Where'd we go? What's my workflow for waterfalls in Lightroom and Photoshop? My workflow in Lightroom and Photoshop is almost the same for everything I do, and that is just check basic exposure, basic white balance, as long as I'm pretty close on that. Make sure that I have detail, highlights, and shadows. Otherwise, it just gets tossed out. I usually go through and sort, and so I give 1 star to anything that I even want to come back and look at, and then I give 2 stars to the ones I want to edit, and then 3 stars to the ones that are edited, and keep going from there. And then I generally tweak the. They changed the names on some of this stuff to me not too long ago, but it tells you how often I get in front of the computer to edit. The intensity, vibrance, that kind of thing. I always, a dear friend of mine in April's once said that he'd never met a flower that didn't like vibrance. And I would say that's true of almost anything outdoors. Nobody's ever going to say, well, the leaves weren't quite that green, were they? They might if you turn it up too high, but it's always nice to have a little bit more vibrance in the color. So I usually start with that. And then I just kind of play around with levels. So I might want to pull the highlight levels down just a little bit so they're not as glaring. I might bring the shadow levels up so I have a little more detail in that area, or something like that. And then I crop, and that's really about all I do. I actually I get that question quite often. How do you fix images in Photoshop? And my answer every time is I don't. I have the luxury of photographing what I want when I want. I mean, to some extent, but no one's paying me to go take a picture of a waterfall. So if I don't come back with exactly the picture that I want, I'll wait till the next time I have an opportunity to go there and take the picture again. And I'm fortunate in that I get to take groups of people to photograph those kinds of things. And I find I get more joy, more inspiration from helping other people do that type of thing. So I would rather just go back and spend more time outside and take more pictures than sit in front of the computer and keep trying to make things look better. How does the L bracket work with the tripod switching horizontal vertical? Well, okay, you can picture this on here, right? So the L bracket's on the bottom of the camera. Then this part down here is Arca Swiss profiled. This part is Arca Swiss profiled, which is just a type of tripod plate that clamps into the top of the tripod. So I can unlock the tripod and reorient it vertically. So my camera is now this way. This would be a lot easier if it was all still attached. But I can go that way, and then I can go this way, and it will clamp in there or there. And if you notice, the lens mount on the front of the camera really doesn't move very far when I do that. Rather than unlocking a tripod head and tipping the whole thing sideways, I've changed my composition dramatically, and I've moved the weight of the camera off of the tripod. So hopefully that made some sense. You will need 2 base plates for rapid land to portrait shifts right. No, you don't need 2 base plates. That's the whole point of the L bracket, is that it essentially is 2 tripod plates in one L-shaped thing. So you already have one on the bottom of your camera and one on the side of your camera. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to put this on most cameras, because most cameras don't have a socket on the side of it to attach a plate. RFP does, but it's the only camera that I've ever seen that actually has multiple tripod sockets. So this way, it already, and the other advantage to an L bracket is this stays on my camera. This lives on my camera, so I don't ever have to think about switching plates around, or it's a bigger investment to make up front, but then I'm never searching for a tripod plate. There's always one on my camera, on the bottom and the side of my camera. Betsy wants to know the fuzzy thing that looks like a poodle head with a bow. Oh. This is a little microphone. Shout out to Rode, who helped us do some research in equipment. This is called the Video Micro, which is kind of their entry-level microphone, I think, but it's a nice little microphone. It's been doing lots of streaming with me, and it shot some videos. I point over there as though you have any clue where the camera used to be and the setup was over there when I was shooting videos. But the fuzzy thing on top is called a dead kitten. It is. The bigger ones are called dead cats, and that goes back to Hollywood days and old micro. I mean, that name's been around for a very, very long time. And that's a windscreen. I can't get to the other one to show you. Sometimes the windscreens are foam, but it just, if the air came on or I was breathed too much on it or something, it just cuts down on the wind noise on it. And the little thing on the back is just its cradle, like the thing that's holding up the microphone, like a little suspension cradle that kind of looks like a bow, I guess is what you're looking at, the red part. Is that a gripped D850? It is. That is what I shoot with almost all the time until I got my Sigma FP, which is the thing that's showing me to you right now, that I love for what it is, but it's not this. It doesn't, well, this isn't that. They're two different cameras. And cameras are tools. You'll hear me say that over and over again if you spend any time with me. And it's all about having the right tool for the job. And this tool does more jobs well for me than most cameras that I've found. So yeah, I love my D850. And I've always had a grip on the camera. It adds weight, but it also adds a lot more battery life, and it adds that vertical functionality that I can shoot this way instead of this way. It's just more comfortable to me as well. So, any other questions? What was the model number for the variable ND filter I showed? It is an MRC. It's an XS Pro. That's the series. Variable, it's called ND Vario, ND-VARIO, 1-5 MRC Nano. Thank you, Ron. Thank you for coming. I really hope everybody got something out of this. I always enjoy teaching, and I enjoy teaching more when I can see people face to face, but this is where we are right now, right? So at least I can still teach and help people out. I think that should have answered your question about the filter. They come in a bunch of different sizes as well. But if you can't find it, April can, and April always knows how to get in touch with me, so I can help her find the right filter as well. But I'm pretty sure she knows exactly what filter that is. What is my opinion of stacking two ND filters? For example, 3-stop plus a 6-stop to achieve near 10-stop exposure. Does stacking noticeably compromise image quality? For straight neutral density filters, no, there's not really a problem at all. The only issue that could happen is light getting in between filters. So if you're using sheet filters, the square ones or the rectangular ones in a holder, and light comes in at an angle and bounces off all the surfaces, it can cause a lot of flare. But stacked circular filters like this, as long as they're really good filters to start with, you're not going to see any difference at all between one filter and two. Like if you had 2 3-stops and 1 6-stop, you wouldn't see a difference between the two, I don't think at all. And I know, like I said, I know people who stack multiple filters, even like multiple 10-stops, to get really, really crazy long exposures. I don't see anything wrong with doing that at all. It's really just multiple polarizers that you don't want to stack. Why does this keep doing that? There we go. Let me turn the microphone back on. You don't want to stack two polarizing filters. And if you're going to put a polarizer and an ND, the polarizer needs to go in the front toward the subject away from the camera. So the polarizer should be on the outside of the stack. The ND filter should be behind that. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Like I said, I'll stick around and answer questions if anybody needs to. You didn't really miss anything in the first 5 minutes. It really is just kind of an introduction, but this is going to, or this was recorded, is being recorded, and April will have a copy of this available somehow. So if you contact her through the store or through Facebook, she'll be able to get you whatever the copy of this presentation. Okay. So if, like I said, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to ask. But just to wrap this up, thank you, Mark, for moderating the questions. That was a huge, huge help. Thank you, April and F32, for supporting Sigma and making this happen, putting this all together, promoting it, all that kind of thing. And remember that there is a rebate or a discount available on Sigma products, Sigma lenses. If that's something that you're interested in, just contact April, and she will help you save money. And also next week, Thursday, but I think an hour earlier. I don't know how that happened, but I'm pretty sure it's 6 o'clock next Thursday is Aaron Norberg, who is another tech like Mark and I, up in Portland, and he's going to be talking about night sky photography, nighttime landscape. Stars, that kind of thing. A great presentation as well, so make sure that you tune in to catch him next week. What are art lenses as opposed to regular lenses? Okay, so I'll give you the short version. 7 years ago when, gosh, almost 8 years ago, the founder of Sigma had passed away and his son had taken over the company, and one of the first things that his son did is a statement, a press release, a change in corporate mentality called the Sigma Global Vision. And that was exactly the vision for Sigma going forward. And part of that vision was to break lenses down into 3 categories to help make it easier for consumers, retailers, those of us in the industry, whatever, to understand what the lens was intended for and some of its like design features. So very, very few of our lenses exist in multiple categories. The only one I know of or can think of off the top of my head is the 150 to 600. We make a contemporary version, which is smaller and lighter. We make a sports version, which is larger, heavier, more ruggedized, more weather sealed. So there's those 3 categories: art, sports, contemporary. The art lenses are lenses designed, manufactured, tested, everything with no compromises whatsoever. They are intended to be the state-of-the-art lenses, and in most cases, they are the best lens of their category. And in some cases, they are the best lenses that some companies have ever tested. Our previous 8514, previous to this little guy, is the highest scoring lens ever on DxO. So according to DxO, it outperforms any other lens from any other manufacturer. But that's kind of the idea of an art lens. So they're built to extremely high standard out of high-tech materials. Any case, that's an art lens. The sports lenses are basically the same optical formulas, the same optical quality of glass, of lenses, but even more ruggedized and even more weather sealed than the art lenses are. And so those are the lenses. They generally are the longer lenses, primes and zooms, but they're the lenses designed for sports and wildlife and that type of work. Then you have the contemporary lenses, which are designed to be more lightweight, more versatile, but still extremely high-performing lenses. So this 100 to 400, is totally out of focus. A little bit better. This is the new mirrorless version. So this one goes on our camera or the Sony E-mount. We make the same lens for Canon and Nikon, or we make another model that's very, very similar to it for Canon and Nikon. But they're just designed to be a little bit smaller and lighter. So they use space age plastic. We call it thermally stable composite, a real high-tech material. So we use more of that in these lenses than we do in the art, but that makes the lens lighter, easier to manage, that type of thing. They're also going to be the all-in-one lenses like the 18 to 300s and those kind of things. Those fall into the contemporary category. So hopefully that answered that question. I tried to make that as quick as possible. All right. So April just gave you all of her information there. You can always find us at sigmaphoto.com, and you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, all that kind of stuff. Okay. All right, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. Thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoyed this and got something out of it. Good night.